Morning, welcome everybody, and it's nice to see you all back again after so many years. Unfortunately, slots hasn't diminished as an issue over the last couple of years, and if anything, it's kind of ramped up the scales of topics that we've had to be dealing with through COVID. So I'd just like to go into today where we are now and just give you a very quick recap. I'm not going to give you all the warts and all on COVID slot relief and waivers, because I think we've all been round that enough times in the last couple of years. But it's just to remind everyone how brutal this has been for the airline industry in terms of the airline planning, and the slot relief that we've had from those governments over the last 3 years has been vital and essential to ensure that the schedules that are now being rebuilt have been there and the foundations were there to reconnect the world again. So when airlines started pulling their schedules apart, that was actually the easier part for them. The slot waivers absolutely allowed them to do that, and it was essential, as I said. But actually, the last year or so has been the really difficult time for airline planning. And as we know, the whole industry struggled with this rebuilding and this ramp up. But the late capacity reductions that we've seen, and then other issues coming online, like the war in Ukraine and the resulting airspace closures, have caused even further dramatic increases to the airlines when they're rebuilding and trying to reconnect the world again. It's important to note that over the last 3 years, the slot rules weren't switched off. It was just the slot use requirements, the use it or lose it rule. And that's something that's really showed the role that the slot guidelines have played and continue to play as we continue to have to rebalance capacity and demand, particularly as we look at 2023. That one element of the slot process that was alleviated was very much led by the slot guidelines and the newly formed Worldwide Airport Slot Board at the time, which was this new governance structure we have with the airlines, airports, and slot coordinators, a first in slots to have the airports and airlines working on policy recommendations collaboratively. And it's really showed us what a role this board could have now going into the future as we see governments starting to open regulations. And now what we're putting forward as a slot board is really the need for flexibility, and I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you, but with all of these issues on the horizons, flexibility is really the name of the game now going into next year. So one of those issues that we really do need to speak about, the flexibility needed, and I know it's already been touched on, is the Russian overflights and the airspace restrictions on some carriers. These are impacting the sustainable recovery of those schedules for the airlines that are impacted in many different ways, depending on the geographical location of the airlines, the routes that they already had, and the networks that they're trying to rebuild now. And of course, the timing and reopening of those markets that has impacted is also a big factor in this. It's impacting the payload, the crew, and of course the fuel, which means the economics of those flights are also hugely impacted. And so what we're asking for right now to governments is to be flexible. Each end of the route is being impacted, and the airlines are doing a great deal to mitigate some of those impacts on the hub and making sure that those flights can still connect into their banks. But that does mean huge retimings on one or the other end of the schedule. With 2, 3, or 4 hour plus flight impacts, there's no way to mitigate this completely. And airlines are doing their utmost to get the passengers where they need to be to connect back in through Asia, Europe, or the US. But it's even affecting flights into India and other parts of the world. So really now, as we see things coming back to normal, we still need that level of flexibility to retime the slots and make the schedule work. So looking ahead, now we've been through COVID and we know that those slot rules are starting to gradually be reinstated back to normal. So we're seeing the return of the 80%, the use it or lose it rule that the airlines have to comply with to get their slots approved for the next equivalent season. We do see challenges, and I know it's just been mentioned about the airport capacity issues we've seen this summer. It is front of mind for us, and we are incredibly concerned that this is dealt with now up front and that we get an honest and collaborative discussion between the airports, the supply chain and the airlines so that those schedules are realistic, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in a minute. Of course, also the regulatory agenda on slots is incredibly concerning. Conrad's already mentioned the UK, the EU, possibly even the US could be looking at their slot rules. And further afield, we've seen issues in Latin America already over the last couple of years, and we see Asia starting to sort of wake up to these issues as well. And so what we're seeing is potentially a complete Pandora's box, if you like, of concern. And those issues on the regulatory side really could dismantle some of the recovery if those proposals put forward are not thought through. And then we also have to deal with these isolated developments coming online. Again, already mentioned, but Amsterdam is a key concern. The reduction in capacity that's been slated as early as for next winter, which would mean planning as early as this spring coming, would essentially mean a huge withdrawal of historic slot rights. And that is something that has never globally had to be implicated. And that implementation of actual withdrawal of historic rights is something that we're watching with a lot of concern. So digging into the regulatory issues going on right now, the slot rules continue, from our perspective, to sort of prop up an industry that's actually failing to provide enough airport capacity, ATC capacity, to actually satisfy the demand that's out there. So I know I've said it before over the last couple of years, but the slot rules really are there as a sticky plaster to cover up a big problem, which is governments and other infrastructure developers not investing enough to satisfy the demand that's out there. And they have continued to facilitate access, growth, competition at these very ultra-congested airports that we have worldwide. And we have to remember there's only 200 airports worldwide that are slot coordinated, but they actually deal with over 50% of the global passenger traffic. What we've seen at these airports that are ultra-congested is a very fair process, a reliable process. And I think COVID's been a good case in point where, although the slot use rules had to be dismantled, the actual runnings of the process season after season continue to work. And the fact that there is still flights connecting you into Geneva in the last 24 hours stands that as a good test of the rules working well. It's allowed us to ensure new routes can come into these airports. It's a very flexible system, so the airlines can diversify how they operate. They can bring new aircraft fleet in, that's really important, and we've seen improved connectivity. So with all of that in mind, what we see on the regulatory agenda is incredibly worrying, as I say, and it could jeopardise that very intricate and complex process that the airlines rely on one season to the next to underpin all of their scheduling, crewing and fleet investments. So really our message to regulators is focus on the right things, not everything, because throwing everything into the works right now could really stifle somewhat the recovery at these airports. So just to dig a little bit deeper into a good case study, if you like, of how the slot rules are continuing to work well. The number of carriers on routes and the competition levels in the EU has continued to go up. And on the screen, you can see on the left, those routes operated by one airline only continue to be a majority in the EU because there is a lot of regional connectivity needed. And this is quite a normal situation where you've got thin routes that need small operators to connect those thinner and lesser served regions into hub airports. But what we have seen, which is incredibly positive, is more than 3 carriers, 4 airlines, 5 airlines operating on a vast majority of routes. And that's actually growing now in the EU. And that's a good story. That's the congested infrastructure that we see in the EU still providing access and opportunity for growth. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see level 3 airports. These are the slot coordinated airports in the EU, actually providing the bulk of routes across the European Union. And even though they are congested and we see lots of stories about access issues, they've actually continued to grow the number of routes that the EU provides. So to us, there isn't a huge case here for reforming slot regulation because actually it's working and the evidence is clear. What we do need to look at is a better rebalancing of the regulation. So there's a lot of talk about stricter airline slot rules, and these, we feel, are not going to achieve any of the objectives actually the governments have also laid down for sustainability, increasing competition and enhancing connectivity, because it adds a lot of risk to the airline side, and the airlines are already achieving an awful lot when it comes to slots. They're required to optimize schedules in advance of the season. They have to lay their plans out for all the supply chain in advance of the season. They then have to utilize those slots at a very, very high level. And then there's the incentive, of course, to actually operate on time as well, because they're monitored on the performance of those slots, not just that they operate them. So if you add all of this risk to airlines, there's actually going to be a disincentive to grow at these slot coordinated airports, which, as we've seen, is where the demand is. Instead, today, what we're seeing is regulators actually ignoring the role the other part of the process needs to play, which is this capacity declaration piece. This is the airport's role. It's very important. It's fundamental to the process at the start. Airports have to declare the capacity they have and can operate, and that's what the coordinator essentially allocates every season. If we get this wrong, we've seen what happened this summer at some airports, and so regular review of that capacity, not just how many slots you have each season, but how they're used, is so important to ensure that what's declared actually can be delivered, and ultimately you as passengers are not suffering at the hands of this process, not doing what it needs to at the very front end. So we've actually championed new approaches in some of these areas in the slot board. So airports, airlines and coordinators have worked through a number of improvements between 2016 and 2019, 2020. Obviously, that wasn't the time to start implementing new slot policy, but now we see governments waking up to this idea. That's where they should be looking, is the new approaches that were detailed in the new slot guidelines on new entrant access, the allocation priorities, and performance management, how coordinators should be managing the airline performance at these airports to ensure an efficient outcome. So just to go into this a little bit more, I'm sure we've laboured the point over a few presentations now, but the responsibility and accountability is missing in the regulation in terms of the airport side. And this is the key focus for us now when we look ahead at next summer is there accountability on the airport side, not just to declare the capacity, but actually deliver it? Because, as I say, the airlines are already heavily mandated to do certain things with their schedules and perform. And if all of this supply chain falls apart, as we know, the airlines are then the ones that are compensating the passengers for delays and cancellations, even for matters well outside their control. And if you've unfortunately been struck by some of these capacity reductions this year and had tickets cancelled or moved well outside of what was your planned summer holiday, you'll know well that it's not enough just to have a retimed or replanned schedule. You need to be able to fly when you expected to. And the same is true of the airlines. If the capacity was given to them for that slot, they expect to be able to operate it. And of course, the reverse is true as well. If the airlines are planning schedules at the airports expect them to turn up on the day and deliver those flights. And that's why we have the slot use rules. So we're really looking for something that's equitable in terms of the airport's delivery on their side, and indeed the rest of the supply chain and ATC as well. So in summary, I suppose it's no surprise to say we believe the slot process is working incredibly well, and actually through COVID it continued to work very well. So it's shown it to be even more flexible than perhaps we all thought it was. Congestion and capacity is going to be a key concern in 2023, and as the recovery really gets going, we're going to see schedules ramping up. With slot rules coming back in place to 80% levels, we can expect schedules to be planned by airlines right back up to 2019 levels. So we're really hoping and praying that the supply chain is ready for that level of operation. As we know, there are other issues on the horizon, and we need to keep flexibility to manage those day in, day out. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but the justified non-use of slots will be a key policy tool to deal with that. But what we're really concerned about now and going forwards is this misguided reform agenda that regulators have. And what we really want them to do is focus on these right things, the slot guidelines, and rebuild their policies in line with this global process so that each end of the route continues to work in the same way. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Please have a seat and we'll see if there are any questions on this key issue. And already I see a hand right at the back. Thank you. Is that Joanna? Ah.
Hello. Joanna Bailey, Simple Flying. Hello. Sorry about that.
I think I heard that all. Thank you. Yeah, the schedule impacts at the moment. I think the airlines are taking it in their stride as a temporary adjustment, and they don't want to obviously permanently move these schedule adjustments. For some airlines, it's obviously been devastating, and the whole hub, if you look at Finnair, the whole hub has had to be reworked. And speaking to some of the airlines, that's meant they're actually waiting on ad hoc capacity, so they're still sort of waiting for other slot processes. It is very much a moving issue, and thanks. And you know they're doing everything they can, but that's why it really is a need for flexibility. And some of the coordinators have been very reasonable and offered this justified non-use of slots, which seems reasonable because it is something totally outside the airline's control. Others we've heard have said, well, the airlines know about this now, so why can't they plan for it? But I think that's sort of somewhat unreasonable given the impact it's having on what is a finite amount of assets to operate these slots. So it's something we're working very hard on.
Thank you. Apologies for the technical problems. If you didn't catch some of that, Joanna, then come and meet Lara later, and we'll sit you down with her. Okay, I seem to have a working mic, so let's carry on. Any other questions for Lara? Yes, Holly.
Fingers crossed you can hear that. Wow. Well done. The Yorkshireman in the room can use technology. Laura, quick one. All of the error slots have all been farmed out, I think I'm right in said, to other airlines. What happens in a hypothetical scenario whereby hostilities, or the war, I should say,
Let me see. Is this going to switch on? Yeah. I caught the end of that. So, yeah, the decisions made by some governments are obviously totally outside of the slot process, and usually borders closed and restrictions in place, the airlines get justified non-use of the slots, and they're held for a number of seasons to return to those carriers when it's outside of their control. This is obviously a very different situation, and governments have applied sanctions, and as part of that have decided that they won't provide justified non-use of slots. So the airlines essentially have not succeeded in meeting the thresholds for use. But also some governments took a very quick decision to put those slots back in the pool. We can't really comment on the decisions the governments have made, but you're right, those slots have now been moved on to other carriers and are being operated, and they are eligible for historics for the other carriers that are operating them. So they have moved out of the pool and are now being operated by other airlines. What will come, I really can't navigate an answer on how the governments will then deal with the reopening, but I suspect we can all imagine there'll be some work within the wider negotiations, how you reconnect with that area of the world when and if it's possible.
Do you want to make any additional comment? Okay. Yes, Sally?
Okay, I'm going to have another go with this now. Is it working? Yeah. So a bit on that subject again, Heathrow is obviously very slot constrained. And my understanding is that a number of large airlines, notably Virgin Atlantic, which has long been lobbying for a greater, parity with slots, say again. Okay, yeah. I think, is this timed for journalist questions? So it actually cuts off after a little while. Yeah, so what's going to happen then? Because there was a bit of a windfall, I think, at Heathrow of these slots once Russian airlines were no longer allowed to operate in and out of the UK. And don't you think IATA should be preparing for that day? Because I think there'll be quite a contentious battle when that day eventually arrives for to reopen that Russian airspace and airlines allowed to operate again in and out of Heathrow, for example.
I think just on the point of the Heathrow reallocation, actually, if we put aside the politics related to that, it actually showed how well the slot process does work, even with the most minute amount of capacity. So on those very few and limited number of slots at Heathrow, using the slot guidelines, the coordinator actually allocated, I think, 7 airlines new flights on what was essentially 2 daily services. So it's an unfortunate situation, but it does demonstrate how well that process works with the allocation priorities that are there to build new carrier access, new routes and competition. In terms of what the governments do, I think it will be a government-led decision-making, and it won't be necessarily a slot guidelines process that decides how to deal with the reopenings when and if they happen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take one more question, but while I'm doing that, can I invite Linda to come down to the front because we'll be moving to her presentation. So I don't know if I can see Linda over there. And I think, sir, you haven't asked a question yet, so please go ahead.
R.K. Patra from Strat Times India. Hi, Lara. You have mostly described about the congested airports. What about the new airports, especially when Mumbai is having a second new airport at Navi Mumbai International Airport, which will be declared open in 24? Any idea about the slot arrangements there?
Well, I suppose to put it simply, I hope we don't have anything to do there, because the new airport, you would hope, has no slots attached to it, because hopefully that capacity is in abundance and the airlines can go in and schedule, with flexibility as they do at most of the world's airports. So any new capacity coming online in a city that already has an existing airport, you'd hope wouldn't require a slot process immediately. That would be my hope.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. I know a few of you had questions. Please let me know and we'll set up more opportunities to speak to Laura, but our time is limited and I'm going to move it on. So thank you very much, Laura, indeed.